Again, thanks for coming. This is the Technical Advisory Committee, March 22nd. You can see the agenda. We're going to pop through a few noise compatibility program land use measures today. Before I kick it off, I'll just open it up. Actually, let's go around the room. I know we're all familiar with each other. My name is Nick Longo. I'm the Deputy Director of Aviation, Chair of this TAC Committee.
Larry Lackey, Director of Engineering here at the airport.
Chris Phillips, I'm the Operations Group Commander for the Vermont Air National Guard.
I'm John Johnston. I'm the Director of Aviation Safety for the Army National Guard for Vermont.
Rick Lazari, I'm the Director of Staff for the Vermont National Guard.
Jesse Baker, City Manager, Winooski.
Paul Connor, Director of Planning and Zoning with the City of South Burlington.
George Melley, South Burlington resident and TAC member, and not a director.
I'm Carmen Sargent, and I'm a resident who live about a block away.
My name is Patrick Elvin. I'm VP for Government Community Affairs at St. Michael's College and a member of the TAC.
Give me minutes. Sorry. I was busy. And my desk gentleman on small business accelerators.
I'm Diane Carter with the Jones Payne Group.
I'm Brad Nicholas with HOMH.
Gene Richards, Director of Aviation. Bob, want to speak yourself?
Bob McEwen, actually represent the town of Essex.
Miranda, the other paper.
So again, thank you for coming. Well, we're going to wrap up this meeting at talking about what the next steps are for the NCP. Of course, after sharing some exciting news and going through some of these land use chapters. Before I keep going, just for formalities, I'm just going to open it up to public comment if there's any member of the public that would like to speak. Seeing none, and again, this presentation, there's copies out the door here. It's online. It will be online after this meeting, and if there's any questions, please let us know. Quick agenda, like I said, well, noise exposure map, and then the land use reuse, the land measures on the noise compatibility program. So you've all seen the email, and we are finally have funding approval for the noise exposure map, which we have already kicked off with HMMH and the Jones Payne Group. Projected to be completed by the end of this, meaning submitted to the FAA by the end of this calendar year. So between now and then, there's going to be a few public opportunities for discussion, a few public drafts of the document. And again, like I started out the meeting, we want to put the TAC meeting on hiatus until we can formulate again with a completed noise exposure map, so that we can compare our discussions over the past few months in the NCP process with a new noise exposure map towards the end of this year.
Nick, do you know if you're going to basically take the same approach as you did on the last one in regards to the weighting of butane? And
I believe it's going to be the same hybrid methodology, and Brett, correct? Brad, you right?
I couldn't quite hear what you were asking in terms of the methodology.
well, the commercial airport was weighted basically by 365, and the F-16s were weighted by the number of days that they
228
flew.
days.
And given that we're trying to predict, it's a prediction model of what the F-35s are, that we need to know the number of flights that are going to be.
Well, we will ask for an estimate of that, and I will speak to what we're getting approved in terms of forecasting, but I would assume we would do a similar methodology and present that to the FAA for approval for that using the model.
Absolutely.
I was just curious.
Yeah, our intent is to use the similar, exactly like Brad just said, the similar methodology as we did in 2000.
It was the FAA's preference last time, so I'm assuming it's the same one. It was a change, and I think it was parts of the discussions that we had in these meetings that brought it to that. So I believe that they're going to stay on track with that. But we'll confirm that and let you know.
So as we go through this meeting, just put it in the back of your head. We'll want some consensus from the group here on if you'd like to proceed with the NCP now or put this TAC meeting on hiatus, we'll continue with the Sound Mitigation Committee. So we'll still have quarterly meetings, just not in the context of noise compatibility program. And then reconvene the TAC membership, again, very similar membership, to discuss the final recommendations of the noise compatibility program with all land use measures in there, as well as a public hearing, public documentation, full draft of the document itself, concurrent with the noise exposure map.
And that will be after that's completed. All of those things you named.
Yeah.
Yes.
So right now, what we would propose is the noise compatibility program, TAC membership, and noise compatibility program in general be put on hold as we kick off the noise exposure map documentation. Once we kick that noise exposure map documentation off, we'll reconvene concurrently with noise compatibility program and noise exposure map later this year, so that they're both moving in the same direction and both being submitted to the FAA towards the end of
Will
this
the
year.
public have an opportunity to have input?
On both documents, it would be later this year. Yeah.
So weren't we, Nick, weren't we on track basically to get the NCP in by this year?
And we still will. It will just be.
You're not going to move it out to the right that much, are you?
Right now, if we delay the noise compatibility program, we're going to submit noise exposure map and NCP towards November, December.
Can you explain just, I don't think George understands how it works, generally, as far
Well,
as.
no, there's funding, Gene, right? There's funding where it's released, or we go after it, or you go after it in September timeframe. And I'm just wondering how that now
So
plays
May.
out with the introduction of the new NEM.
So
Can you
we
just explain why you're waiting? I mean, if you could. Like, why you're doing, just the steps, why you're doing them in the order that you're doing them?
Sure, we want to make sure that everybody has seen this draft exposure. We've heard from Winooski, South Burlington. We'd like to make sure everybody sees this draft, at the very least, draft noise exposure map, and move forward with a public hearing on the new contour lines, inclusive of F-35s. And that way, all homeowners or property owners can weigh in on noise compatibility measures concurrently with noise exposure map documentation.
So the proposed actions in the NCP will be reflective of the new noise exposure map? Is that what I'm hearing?
Most likely, we're not going to propose any different
noise
noise compatibility program land use measures. Those will all be the same as we've discussed in the
Well,
past.
but I think to George's point, the reason for putting a pause for a short period of time on the noise compatibility plan is so that if there is something that we learn from the noise exposure maps, or in the case of, I'm guessing, our partners in Winooski, where right now the noise exposure maps don't incorporate them, but they have to provide input on a plan that they don't know what it affects.
Right.
It gives the opportunity for us, and importantly, public, to weigh in on the plan that will affect them based on the new noise contours.
Correct.
Rather than being in a place where we have a plan that's in effect, the noise contours are then delivered, and then we say, well, it'll be 5 years till we can update the plan. Sorry, you didn't get a chance to weigh in on what is going to be the conditions in 6 months.
I mean, the noise contours, my gut is telling me, okay, that the geometry of the noise contours are going to change. Based on the aircraft, the dynamics and the characteristics of the aircraft, lateral noise, blah, 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 all that stuff, right? And that it'll probably affect different areas as a result, right? Which means that from an NCP standpoint, you probably won't be introducing any new programs.
Correct.
But the NCP may reflect some different numbers.
Correct.
Or geographies.
Or geographies, exactly.
But I think the challenge, and from Winooski's point of view, I'm very appreciative of this change, because the challenge is, while the measures may not change, right now we're being asked for feedback on measures that may or may not affect our residents, and they don't know who may or may not be affected. Right. So to run them more concurrently, we can get more appropriate feedback from our residents about what those measures could be.
And I can most certainly appreciate trying to make an informed decision without information is kind of tough.
We've taken a course because we think it's the right way, but we're open to discussion, but it seems to be the right path.
So the side effect, Nick had shared this with me a week ago or so. The downside side effect to this for us is that in terms of the funding cycles that you had shared, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, I'm just trying to rephrase what you had described to me. Because the NCP would be submitted towards the end of the year, and the FAA has a certain 180 days or something like that to review it, it is possible, if not potentially likely, that the normal annual funding cycle of April could be missed in April 2019 because the
Correct.
plan won't have been approved. So that's the side effect.
That's the.
Correct.
I
Now-
think that probably it's worth it. It's unfortunate. It is a side effect. We should acknowledge that. But I think you also said that there are, from time to time, off-cycle
Correct.
funding opportunities like
Perfect.
the current one that's being enacted.
Yep.
So-
In fact, the last one we received in 2016 was at the end of the federal fiscal year when there was some extra discretionary monies left in this noise program for the FAA budget. So there's always opportunity. We can apply for a grant any time, but the New England region gave us May 1st as the deadline to apply with any grant, but there's always opportunity.
What I've learned, for the short time I've been here, is that we need to be our own advocates, and we need to advocate for everything and more. And we've benefited from that. Like this noise map is a great example that people, they told us 3 or 4 times, and we kept pushing. So I think we need to keep pushing for everything and anything that we can get. And I'm a firm believer in, if we work together and we're united on a decision, that we will get heard much louder.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, Gene. I mean, I know the legislature goes through a funding cycle, okay, to fund basically the FAA. And then they, in turn, take monies out of that general fund, that big fund, and put it into the regions. And then once it's in the hands of the regions, right, all of the airports within that region compete for those monies based on whether or not they're a large hub, medium hub, small hub, or whatever the heck they are, right? And I have some anxiety about going to the trough too late. You know what I'm saying? I most certainly respect, Williston and Essex and Winooski's position of wanting to know what they're dealing with, but at the same time, I hope the well isn't dry by the time we get there.
I think you're going to find us not. I think that we are a priority for them. And also there's money that we always go back for that isn't used by others. And what we will do, and we always do, is we check the availability for that. So again, I think let's stick together and let's see what we can do to accomplish the best possible results. We'll advocate for the money, believe me.
I got a head shake no from the gentleman across the table, so I'm not as worried.
When we're ready to get funding, I think we've got a case.
He's actually
Very
very
short. Huh? He's a master at getting money.
Yes, he's done
I
very,
believe
very
that.
well for this airport.
Bob's been around for a long time, so if he says no, then I guess my anxiety level, my blood pressure just came down.
But a good
That's all.
reminder is always great. I think let's stay united here.
And sincere thanks for pushing to get the noise exposure
Yeah.
map update.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for pushing us to push it.
On all of this too, the priority given to Burlington because of the extent of this program is very high nationwide, but definitely in the region. So even if we do come in with a grant application after, our May deadline, they're very aware and very understanding that we have a very high priority.
Welcome to free conference calling.
So they're
The
sensitive
conference has
to
not
our
started.
situation as
If you are
well
the
as
host,
politically
please
and
enter your
otherwise.
4-digit host code to open the conference.
There's-
If you are
they
not the
already tell you
host,
they're-
please
they
press
also
the... We will now connect you to your call. There are 1 attendees in this conference.
Forgot to set that up. Sorry.
Also, the director, did I already tell you that we have a new one?
No.
This is not, we don't have a new one yet, but she resigned. So the one that wanted us to buy houses, the one that, was not very supportive, many times to me, she wanted us to buy more homes. And I'm talking about the program. So she's stepping down in April. So
Who's taking their seat?
we don't know yet. They say it could take up to a year to fill the position.
Who's
but-
AC Ting?
One more time?
Who's AC Ting? Who's acting?
Right now, yeah, Mary's still there for a couple more weeks, but Gail Luttrell, she was the deputy director there, so she'll be.
She's solid. She's a good person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're well represented by who we have there. And Mary is just passionate on her position. And I think that, we have to be passionate on ours and keep pushing it.
So at the end of the meeting, I'll circle right back to the, hopefully not as lengthy of a conversation on this, but just a consensus of if we want to delay the TAC meetings until we have a noise exposure map documentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it right over to Brad to just talk about the noise exposure map for a little bit.
Just to remind everybody on the NEM process here, NEM's noise exposure map, it's going to lay out the airport operations and noise levels that result from those, and show how that noise exposure relates to local land use. You're going to create two maps. One is going to be the existing conditions, which the FAA wants to be the year of submission. So that's the thing that's pushing schedule here. We really need to have this submitted in 2018 so we can get the F-16 operations in there. Forecast year is going to be F-35. Again, as we said earlier, putting the NCP process on hold a little bit so that you have a chance to look at what those noise contours look like for the purpose of making decisions. In terms of the, let's do that, there we go. In terms of the schedule, it basically lays out data collection and development of the operational input to the model in the spring. Summer is the development of the draft contours and the land use analysis. Concurrent with this is collection of land use data from the local municipalities and vetting that data and getting it all together, but then evaluating compatible and non-compatible land use, doing counts of population, things like that occurs throughout the summer. There's a pretty short period here for the review. Now on the NEM, remember this is not you're reviewing measures. This is, we have inputs that say these are the conditions. It's kind of NEM's really a just the facts sort of situation. Here are the inputs. This is what's happening at the airport. Results in this noise exposure. So really, it's about those inputs, making sure they're reasonable, and then making sure the collected land use reflects reality. So you're making good decisions. Then going into the NCP process on what are your compatible and non-compatible land uses, and then getting that submitted to the FAA for their approval. There are little review portions in there. We have a review of some noise modeling inputs, and there'll be forecast review, a review of the actual draft contours, and then in the final one there, the actual getting that finalized and submitted.
Where in this timeline would you see the this technical advisory committee kicking back up to start talking about the noise compatibility plan?
I don't know if we've developed that at this point.
My opinion, my thought is kind of in that yellow area. When we have a first draft public document, I think we really should reconvene the TAC meeting to kind of wrap things up after a certain amount of time, so that your leadership and constituents can really look at it as well, and then come back for public hearing.
So Nick, from a commercial standpoint, since we're going after this and it's what, the last one is 215, we've had some, we've had an additional carrier, some additional flights, but the fleet mix shouldn't be too much different.
Not from a commercial standpoint.
Not from a commercial standpoint.
There's a couple of different shifts in airline, it's called upgauging in aircraft, but it's really not going to be significant.
And we haven't seen a difference in mix, loading, that kind of stuff. So that's not going to change too much, right?
And in terms of what defines the noise contours, the focus is going to be on those military operations.
Yeah. In terms of employments, we are up 9% last month.
That's good.
Just an FYI.
That's good. It's good for business.
Is.
Awesome.
It is.
But You know, one of the areas that I've always been curious about, I mean, now that we have version 7, the INM version 7, we're probably going to use the same version.
We're on to AEDT now, the
Okay.
Aviation Environmental Design Tool.
Is that 2.0, 2B?
I think we're at 2C right now.
2C? Okay.
Maybe even 2D.
So we're probably not going to be using the environmental aspect of that tool, are we?
We're doing noise.
You're just doing noise, so you're not going to include any of the
Air quality.
Air quality.
Nope,
Okay.
that is not part of this.
Yep. All right. So it does still have the capability of being able to predict noise for taxiing.
We
And
will submit
ground.
the methodology that we used last time, which was, yes,
Okay.
we kind of work in the, I'm not going to get into technical
No,
details,
no,
but
I
the
just
same
wanna-
methods we used previously would
Okay.
work in the model. We will submit them for approval to the FAA.
And then the assumptions with regards to the FBO activity for engine run-ups at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning?
Again, we have all the same capabilities in terms of modeling taxi and run-up that were in the INM.
And again, just based on the changes that I've observed between buildings 5 and 6, there's been a little more activity there than usual as well. So you'll be taking that into consideration, I'm sure.
We would do a survey about the ground operations. We would check with Tower Airport, anybody else we can while we're up here on taxiway utilization and
All right.
get those inputs vetted, yes. Yes.
Agency review on this chart means the airport?
Means FAA.
And
So
then-
back to Paul's question, if the NCP is going to stand up in the orange section, I'm wondering if the intent would be to use the other sound meeting for regular updates on this process and to check in on information you might need from us about land use planning or anything like that?
Yeah,
Does
sounds
that be the
good.
intent?
Yeah, absolutely. And this one's a little bit different, correct me if I'm wrong, Brad, but the noise exposure map doesn't receive approval from the FAA. It doesn't have that 180-day
No, it is
timeline behind it.
accepted.
It's accepted by the FAA.
It meets the requirements of Part 115.
So that those green lines in there are, we're going to obviously keep the FAA informed the entire way through. So by the time we actually submit it to the FAA, they're going to have a full understanding of where we are, what we went through, what the maps look like already, and submitted and then accepted almost immediately. In 2015, I think they accepted it almost immediately.
And just to be clear, though, this is the timeline to get us to submit with a 2018 date on it. They could take longer to review both either aspect of it, but the whole point of this timeline is to get that 2018 date on there, so we're not moving into a year where you have less military operations in 2019.
And that's a calendar year.
Yep. Anything else? We'll move on to barriers. Okay. So the treatment here of sound barriers and buffers is really going to be a conceptual treatment. In terms of doing an analysis, really there's not a lot of sense in looking at areas where there's going specific areas or like technical analysis, because we're going to redo the noise exposure maps here. So we'll put that off, but let's give you a bit of background here. Noise barriers are used, you've probably seen them along roadways, you may have seen them around, sometimes around HVAC equipment, you'll see a barrier around things like that. They can be effective at airports for taxi noise or movements around a gate area. And airport buildings as well can offer shielding in addition to a barrier. To work, you have to meet a couple of conditions. The barrier really needs to be high relative to the source. If your barrier is low enough that you can see the source, essentially the barrier is not doing anything. It has to block that line of sight between the house or the receiver and the noise source. They need to be close to one or the other. And if you're close to the source, you block noise in that entire direction for everybody. If you're close to the receiver, it's only the houses right behind that that have a benefit. If you go a little ways back, those houses don't get a benefit. So kind of bang for the buck, you want a barrier close to your source. But either one can reduce noise if they're close. If you're in the middle, the sound can easily just go right over the top of that, even if it does block the line of sight. So you want to be close to one or the other. And that little caveat on the high there, that difference, how high it is relative to the source, is also relative to the wavelength of sound. If you've ever listened to music coming from a car or something, or a band around the corner in a city, something like that, you hear those bass frequencies tend to make their way around corners really well, whereas the high frequency, you may be able to hear the band, but you can't understand the singer, because there's a lot of high frequencies in the speech that get blocked very easily. It's easy to block high frequency. It's hard to block low. So barriers generally have to be pretty big relative even to the wavelength of sound to be effective. So there's a lot of caveats to making that work. There are some constraints as well. You cannot put tall things close to flying aircraft is the short of it. So the FAA has regulations on that. It typically means that a barrier is not going to, of sufficient height to do anything acoustically, is not going to be constructed near a runway. You'd have to be farther back off the runway. Which means that the cases I know of it being of barriers being implemented, it's usually at a run-up location or along a ramp area, not to actually block noise from start of takeoff roll. You have a hard time getting that barrier. I have seen some studies looking at ones that are on the community side that haven't been implemented. There's kind of a cost benefit going on there. Again, only the houses right directly behind the barrier would receive that benefit. If you're building barriers near the community on the receiver side, you have a couple of downsides. It could be visually undesirable. Some folks don't want a giant barrier near them. Other folks may not care. It would be a community decision on whether that's a good or a bad thing. And you just have all the siting. There's an orientation bullet there. You have all the siting requirements, trying to figure out what you can actually do. Do you actually have the property available in that area to build a barrier? If it's all private property in the area, you would have trouble doing that. And the complications there at the end is you're going to have differences of opinion on whether or not people would want that barrier. Let me go. So the FAA does have in their Airport Improvement Program handbook some requirements for funding a barrier. It needs to reduce noise by at least 5 decibels in a non-compatible area. So that's going to mean certain types of land uses like residential, and the noise level has to be over 65 dB DNL. And once mitigated with that barrier, again, which would only block ground noise sources, not noise from the air, you would not be eligible for other mitigation measures. So kind of weighing that against other programs. So pluses and minuses here. Advantage, it can provide noise relief to those who are near the wall, or in cases where the wall could be located next to the source. It could provide a more broad benefit. It could be a positive that it provides a visible barrier between a residential area and the operations. That's a plus minus for the community to think about. Disadvantage, you're going to reduce ground noise but have no effect on other sources of noise and not be eligible for other programs such as sound insulation in the particular area where the barrier was constructed. It's typically very expensive, and especially if you're building a barrier that's on the community side, would only benefit that small area near the barrier. And just in practical terms, when you're pursuing different measures through the FAA getting grants, you would have that complication. Seeking a grant for this measure may delay other measures being implemented. Yes.
So 2 questions on this subject. On the previous slide, you had talked about if a home receives a 5 decibel reduction in sound it would not be noise, it would not be eligible for a different program.
Mhm.
Inside or outside?
Outside. But if it would have the same effect inside as outside.
Okay. Whereas, say, the insulation programs are intended to reduce sound by up to 20 decibels, right? To try to bring it down from 65 to, or sorry,
Yes.
bring it down to under 45 inside,
Right,
whatever it happens.
and usually the programs are designed to give a 5 decibel improvement over what the current houses provide. I say not usually. That is a requirement of the programs.
Okay, so that's a target of the program either way.
A 5
That's-
decibel reduction, yes.
Whether it's the sound barrier or
Mhm.
insulation, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then second question, you mentioned as you were going through there that there are some, sometimes they can be beneficial in targeted locations, a run-up or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess 2 questions from that. One is, have you looked into whether there's any, or is it part of the scope of this project to look into see whether there are any opportunities to do that here in targeted locations? And if so, what extent of homes would that improve / make ineligible for other improvements?
Yes, we actually started down the road of kind of categorizing some things, but then when we knew the money was coming and the start of the NEM, decided not to waste time on doing an analysis of locations that we were just going to redo anyway. So yes, it is the intention to finalize this section of the NCP recommendation, bringing to the committee and saying, yes, there are, or no, there are not areas where this could potentially be beneficial. Again, I think we put that in the context of, are there areas where you could get that 5 dB benefit, and then saying, but is there also, say, significant noise from airborne sources that it wouldn't be a benefit? It's really, I mean, I'm not trying to push one way or the other. I think there are situations in which either makes sense. A lot of times, though, if you're going to reduce all noise sources by through sound insulation, you're kind of getting the benefit you would for the barrier, but you're getting benefits for all sorts of noise sources.
Right. I think, sorry, go ahead. I got
No,
one
you
more
go
thing.
ahead. No, you're fine.
This is a speculation on my part, not data-based one or survey-based one, but I wonder whether there are certain circumstances of overnight activities or very early morning activities that may not be a dramatic contributor to the overall dB impact, but for which are potential high return on investment for quality of life in neighborhoods if a noise could be reduced at 3 a.m. from when there's a repair system that takes place that only happens once a month. It probably doesn't move the line very much, but it could be a significant quality of life. And how does something like that get accounted for?
Well, for the FBO activity, you actually need a GRE. I mean, I've looked
There's
at it.
way too many acronyms in that.
Ground run-up enclosure, okay?
Okay.
I mean, I've looked at, I mean, based on the physics, right? If you go to the Department of Transportation.gov's homepage, look at noise, look at wall barriers. I mean, from a physics standpoint, you're talking about proximity, you're talking about density, and you're talking about geometry. And for me, where I'm at, between 5 and 6, the thing average has to be 8 times wider than it is high to be effective. For me, for that thing to be effective, it would have to be 27 feet high. So do the math. 8 times 27. Guess what? There's not enough property between those two buildings on our side to protect us, or on the airport side to make that happen. It's not going to happen.
So, just to get back to your question though, yes, airports have seen things that tend to particularly annoy people that don't necessarily show up in the DNL and have pursued barriers for that. What I present to you here is that the FAA will not fund something unless it meets that 5 dB criteria. So if it doesn't affect DNL, the FAA is not going to pay for it. You're not going to get a grant to do it, and barriers are expensive. Have airports, some places, somewhere, built barriers for things that don't affect DNL, but it's been a big community concern. It has happened at some airports, yes.
Yeah.
And going off of that, actually, the airport's looking at opportunities that we can add some items to fence lines and things like that that may help with some of the sound outside of this program here.
So then my last question on this, and I'll button my lip after this, is understanding that it may not be eligible for FAA funding, is it advantageous, disadvantageous, or completely neutral to put it in the plan?
Like a GRE?
Well, to Nick's example of some other funding, right.
I don't see a benefit of having it in the plan if you're not, I mean, to be pretty crass about it, a lot about the plan is to get money for things.
To get money from the FAA
From the
or to
FAA.
get money for things?
From the FAA.
Okay.
So there's not a lot of advantage of putting the measure in there that you will not get funding for.
Okay, so that's different from our world, for example. When we have a plan at a municipal level, we can use that plan to advocate from all sorts of different funding sources. So we might say it's in our plan to do this, and the EPA happened to come up with a funding source. In your world,
This is an FAA design study for the purposes of
okay, so
of
there is
interacting
no
with the
advantage
FAA, really.
to having it in a plan and then pointing to that plan when
In the FAA plan, but outside of that plan, through sound mitigation committee meetings and through airport operating budget, there may be some opportunity.
So where do we document that we're supportive of that
Through
as a community?
Through
But how do we get it into something it's the policy of the airport to want to pursue money that falls out of the sky to advance?
And it's actually not money that falls.
Well,
out of
I
the
just
sky.
mean, I'm trying to not pick a specific funding source.
For an example, is the dog park. What's her name? The one from
Maggie?
Yeah, what a wonderful lady.
I'll let her know that she's got. You're
Sorry.
for it.
We had an amazing meeting with her, and she brought us this soundproofing material. And we called the company, and I said, "Yeah, we do this for airports?" They go, "Absolutely." So we talked today, we call it George's fence. And, because there's an area down here where there's tends to be some noises, ground noises. So we started thinking how we could use things like that. So the answer is, I think we do need to document it. We do need to write it down about practices moving forward when we make changes, when we add things on. For ground noise, I understand it won't be funded, but there are things that the airport can do to help out, and we will.
That's great, and I guess so. I'd like to sort of get you guys to have your brains turning on what's the best way to document that as being a goal.
Basically, continuity and plan, because if you put it in your plan, knowing full well that it won't be funded, at least there's a base plan in place where other funding from other sources can point to and say, hey, look, things are copacetic here.
Let's just make a
It's
note.
in this plan, so therefore.
What we'll do is we'll make a note. We know this is not, if you're not moved to this, we know it's not potentially fundable, but it is a management tool that the airport would like to adopt moving forward when having given the opportunity to work with the community, putting up new fencing or other things, that we'd add these amenities where necessary and when we come together on things.
Yeah, Jean, I think that's a great idea, and I think that one of the reasons that we're here today doing this NCP update is because you want to add new things that aren't in your current plan. So putting a lot of things in your plan, I call it, putting a lot of tools in your toolbox, allows you the ability to change when times change, implement things that are right for you at that time. So while a barrier may not be the right answer today, we don't know where we're going to be 5 years from now. Sound insulation may sound great today, but maybe you want to shift to something else later. So if we have all those tools in the toolbox, then you're able to have more flexibility in terms of funding.
Right, and put a GRE in there. They're only about 12, 14
Sure.
million. Just throw a GRE
Okay.
in there while you're at it, okay?
Get it in writing.
Yeah. No, if you put tools in the toolbox, it's just a big thing.
Yes, it is.
Charge it to me.
No.
You done?
Yeah, I think so.
If I win the lottery, how about that?
Yeah.
I'll be magnanimous and
Can I ask, how much money in total has been spent on home purchases?
Over the life of the program?
Yes. How many
Um,
millions? Millions.
Millions
We can find out that information. I don't have it off the top of my head. In the last 5 years, it's close to 40 million
Bob, do you know?
on grants.
No, it's, you know, we started out, the value of the homes was $150,000, $60,000, and now they're,
But you've taken almost 200 homes.
yep. Probably
So
60 million.
it's hard for me to understand that a barrier would be too expensive when you've spent that much money to buy homes that benefits the airport, that entity, when the barrier would benefit the community, although they say just the ones that are near it. But I think for per capita investment, you're helping a community, whereas with taking homes, you're ruining a community. So I think you have to, it's all in a frame of mind, and like Paul said, you know, I have a daughter that uses a wheelchair. I never took no for an answer for any piece of equipment that she needed because I was going to find it. And I always found everything she needed, and I think you have to go at this the same way. The FAA won't fund it, well, there's somebody that will with money all over the place. So I don't think you should take no for an answer. I think you should build it into everything we do. But I'm really bothered by the word expensive measure when I can't imagine that it's going to cost anywhere near as much as the purchase of all these homes has.
So we will certainly advocate for it. As we said, we will, wherever we can put it in, and again, it's not our wording, it's the FAA program, and I think that we have to work with them and make this our plan the best that we can.
And the other day when I drove down Airport Drive going to an appointment, the Blue Jet, the exhaust, was probably, maybe 20 feet from the fence line.
You sure it was on?
No, but it has to be on to get it out of there.
No, it actually
No.
doesn't. No, that's a George
Oh,
thing.
okay.
No, you have to understand, the world changed
Go
because
ahead,
of George.
pick
They
it up. Go ahead.
actually- let me explain.
How high would that fence have to be?
You're making an assumption, but you shouldn't be making.
I did make this.
Okay, but you
Yes, you're
shouldn't,
right.
because
You backed it
how
up
many
there
years
with the
ago?
machine?
4 years, 5 years ago? Whenever I came here, George and I met one morning early.
5:35.
5:35, and since then, we
You're
had
not
towed,
doing that anymore?
we tow them out.
Okay, thank you.
And then they
for
started,
saying that.
not there.
And then there was a United plane that was going,
Same thing,
that you tow all of those.
we do.
Okay, thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
I did observe.
That was rather interesting. I was up on the ladder redoing my soffits, putting them back into place
When?
that happened.
Oh, at 5 o'clock in the
We
morning?
met, he said.
I didn't get to do it
Jane,
then.
come over now. I said, it's only 5 o'clock.
Okay.
He was quick.
In the morning.
I told him about it. 3 minutes later, he told me what would happen, by whom, and what he was going to do. It was awesome.
We did it, and we're doing
And
it.
so when you do this, when you come up with, you know, when we did, I didn't do it, so I shouldn't say we, that's including me in it. When the survey of residents was done by the South Burlington City Council, the sound barrier got the most, by far, the most picks for yes, that's what they want. So I would like to see you compare, you know, prices on home purchases and building a barrier. Because I think you're benefiting totally different parts of the population. And I think it would really weigh with people how they come to their conclusions about things.
And you know, all the questions you ask will be asked to the FAA, so, you know, it's more of what their tolerance level is and what they'll allow in the program.
I was saying, put it in, and from a consistency standpoint, continuity standpoint, then it's there. We can point to the plan. It's not funded, then at the very, very least, the community has a thing to point to, Gene, and seek other forms of funding. But if it's not in the plan, it just raises up, to me, from an engineering standpoint, it raises a flag. You're asking for this and it's not there, huh? That's a source kind of
I
thing.
completely get it, so we'll put it in the plan.
Thank you.
All right, well, good evening. Thank you for coming here tonight. It was because of me that we had to postpone last week. I apologize. My flight got delayed on the way up here from Florida and due to the storms. So thank you for making it. I did get to fly up on a new Delta flight out through Atlanta yesterday came in on an Airbus last night, which was nice. It was a brand new plane. And the flight was oversold, and they offered $900 if you would give up your seat. So this would have been a dinner meeting, but I didn't get the $900. So next time, maybe we'll have a dinner meeting if I'm able to give up my seat and still get here on time. The presentation we had prepared was from last week before we knew we had the grant. Now we know that the grant for the noise exposure map is here, and so we're going to still talk about these land use measures, but not in the sense of having to come to decisions tonight. I think you'll see these slides are very wordy. I'm not going to read them all to you. You can read them yourselves. If you have any questions, we'll go through them, and then we're going to sort of set things aside a little bit while we get the maps going and see where we're at with the maps and what the maps look like, so that we can have a more informed decision when it comes to picking some of these measures. At least that's our recommendation, and we'll circle back to that at the end of the evening. So moving on from sales assistance and from barriers, the other mitigation measures we've mentioned several times before but wanted to talk about in detail tonight were sales assistance. And this is where the properties are being sold. These are homes in the 65 noise level, and it is an arm's length transaction from the airport standing. The homeowner sells to another owner. It's sold on the open market for fair market value. The airport never acquires the home, but there is a navigation easement, and that is given in consideration for value that the airport would kick in if the offer is for below market value. It could be if a home is selling at $300,000 and somebody offers $295,000, the airport would kick in $5,000 and the seller would be made whole. Or it might be other types of things. It might be painting a house or carpeting or some repairs or some type of thing. So it's a program where it's just one owner sells to another owner. There's no change in land use. We're not buying any property in the area and removing the residential sales. Just in terms of implementation, the owners are required to give an easement before the property is sold. The home will be appraised following federal guidelines, and the home must be based on the fair market value of that appraisal. And the airport will pay all of the closing costs on the sale, so that doesn't come out of the seller's or buyer's costs. They also pay the realtor's commission. Sometimes the home may sell for full market value. We want to encourage that as much as possible. We want to keep the values up. So because the commission's being paid typically, that's the consideration for the easement. The airport will do what's called a market absorption study. This looks at what the sales are, the number of sales are in any given neighborhood, and how many sales can be born at any given time. You don't want to flood the market with 50 houses, all in sales assistance all at once. That may affect the pricing of the neighborhood, and the goal is to keep the neighborhood value stable. So this looks usually on an annual basis about how many sales can occur over a year, and that keeps the market stable, so there's no concern from people remaining in the area about housing values potentially declining.
So Diane, the comps that are done are outside of the neighborhood?
The comps that are done
on the existing homes
on
that
the
are
existing
affected
homes
are compared to homes that are not affected.
I don't know the answer to that. I think they are done in the area, but it's something I'll have to go back and verify.
Like, okay, I got a set of homes that are depressed, I got a set of homes that aren't. If I compare a depressed home against another depressed home, then how is that fair market value?
Well, it's what the market will bear for the neighborhood.
Not affected, then that would be a more realistic fair market value.
Well, it's what the market will bear for that neighborhood. So if you're not picking up the house and moving it to another neighborhood, and there's no relocation benefits. But I will verify that, George.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
So how would you prevent, let's say, an X amount of number of homes going on the market all at the same time?
Right.
How would
So
you prevent
that's where this market absorption study comes in. If it says that we can hold 10 sales is all that neighborhood can bear, then we would sort of measure that out so we don't put all 10 houses on the market at the same time.
And how would you pick and choose which 10 houses go out?
That's a good question. That would be up to the airport as they develop their policy and procedures. Typically, the way these programs work is they start in the highest noise levels and work their way out. However, depending on the people who are interested and what the area looks like, that may move around a little bit depending on what's best. We wouldn't want to put 4 houses all next to each other for sale at the same time. Maybe we'd want to spread them out in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of factors to that would come into play.
One more question. How about if somebody wants to put their house on the market but does not want to participate in this program?
You are free to sell your home at any time.
And would that go into your numbers calculation?
It would not. No. At once a year, the market absorption study would be updated, unless there's just so many sales happening that we would need to relook at what's happening in the market. But typically, we're looking at what the average markets are, and if people are selling their homes, we just don't want to flood the market with 50 homes if only 10 homes a year are selling, that type of thing.
I just wonder about the easement and how that would also affect the property value.
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody chooses to participate in your program, they would have an easement, whereas somebody else wouldn't.
Correct.
How does that affect the value? And what does the easement mean?
The easement, that's been a big topic of conversation here, what the language in the easement is. Typically, easements acknowledge that there is aircraft in the area that are making noise and that you'll see and hear them. They can also add other language to them regarding light and emissions. The actual language for the easement has not been worked out yet. Those are things we've been talking through this process, but it'll at least say that this home is near an airport and it does experience noise from aircraft. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of advantages and disadvantages that we've identified. One of the disadvantages is that this process can be slow depending on market conditions. You never know where the market's going to be. It could be very hot right now and lots of homes are selling. We could go into a time where we have another recession and the homes we're only a couple selling at a time, and so it could really slow down the process. It's just something to be aware of, but we do know that it keeps the tax base, doesn't take homes off the tax rolls. It's a good alternative if you don't qualify for sound insulation and you want to relocate. That is an option for people instead of getting nothing. And you're guaranteed for fair market value, and that's a big consideration for people.
Can you elaborate on that last bullet point? The alternative for properties which do not qualify for sound insulation?
Correct. So you'll remember that in order to be eligible for sound insulation, you have to have an interior noise level that is above 45 dNL. So we have to go in and do an acoustical test. And we say, the inside of your home measures at a level, and if you're below 45, then the FAA will not pay for sound insulation. They're saying you're the 20 dB below 65, you're 45, and therefore you're compatible.
Okay, but it would still then potentially be eligible for this program?
Correct.
Okay, so in the instance where there was a home that was in the 65 or 70 decibel line, but for whatever reason was well insulated,
right,
it could be in that circumstance. Okay.
Yeah. So for homes that don't qualify for sound insulation, whether it's sales assistance, purchase assurance, or just a straight easement, they would be eligible for those other 3 programs. So that's sales assistance. That's the owner sells on the open market to another person. Purchase assurance is the owner selling their home for fair market value, same appraisal process, but the airport buys it. They buy it for the fair market value and take possession of the property. And again, there's no relocation benefits. It's not like the land acquisition program. The home will stay and the land use will remain residential. The airport will put an easement on it. It will sound insulate it and it will resell it. So that's a fairly quick process. For the sellers, as long as there are grant funds. And when we get to the end of this, you'll see we've looked at some average costs that we're estimating. So you can sell your home. You don't have to wait for it to go through the marketing of a real estate agent, but you are still conveying an easement. Your property, your closing costs are still paid for. That's an eligible cost by the airport. And again, we're looking at the market absorption so that we're not having 10 houses with sales assistance and 10 houses that we're buying on purchase assurance. And again, there's all this activity in a neighborhood that might be affecting the neighborhood value. So they work hand in hand, purchase assurance and sales assistance, if they are both being offered. So that's something you have to look at when we're looking at this market absorption and what happens to the sales in the neighborhood. It is a longer process because it has to go through sound insulation. That's about an 18-month process given the grant cycles of designing the house and then actually doing the construction and then marketing and selling it. So there are going to be vacant properties in those neighborhoods with purchase assurance, and that's something for people to be aware of. Again, I think we've talked about this.
Does the airport then have an option to take it down if it doesn't sell? Or do you just keep on the market until it sells?
I would think they would keep it on the market until it sells. There's
We don't want to be taking down homes anymore, and that's, we come to that agreement. So it would be stay on the market, and what we've done with, the problem is the minute we buy a property and it goes vacant, it gets vandalized. And so we have to think differently than the way we had before. So what we've done at Kirby Cottages is we put security people in there so that the buildings don't get vandalized, because if they have value and you expect them to go back on the market or not to be torn down, you don't want them to be vandalized. So you have to think differently. And the FAA did agree to that, having us have somebody in it until we come up with a direction, for those houses. So I would want to do something like this again, because people come in, they rip out the copper, and we come in and the basement's full of water and the place is ruined. Then it would get torn down, and that is not the desire of the community or the airport. And it happens sometimes within days. It's unbelievable.
Well, that's always the challenge with those programs. And then the last one is just a purchase of the aviation easement, purchasing the air rights above the house. And this is a straight purchase that is in exchange for an easement. The homeowner is given a check for cash. It has to be under $10,000 per property. That's the regulations. There is no change to the underlying land use, but it does give the homeowners who want to stay in the area, who don't want to sell their house and move, but don't qualify for sound insulation. If they're interested in selling the easement, there is a mechanism for them to at least have some type of mitigation. It then provides, and one of the things we've talked about with regard to easements is whether the neighborhood is checkerboarded with easements or not. So allowing people to have the option of having something other than nothing is something to think about. Yes.
So the easement, the wording for the easement, like you said earlier, still hasn't been
correct.
Formed.
Right.
Is there a general shape to it, or?
We did provide some sample easements that are used at other airports that are on the website. If you want to look at them, I think they were in the second TAC meeting.
Yeah, and they're good
Last
examples
meeting.
too, because they've already been approved by the New England region, FAA, New England region. It's not to say that's what we're looking for.
The FAA doesn't actually require it for.
They do not for sound insulation.
For the sound insulation.
But they do if you're going to be given a check.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, you have to.
I do think when we're done with this, we should probably take a shot at this group or lawyers or different folks that can help the people with the rights of their homes and land and how we want them to be perceived in the future, to take a shot at it. I think Vermonters doing things their way, add a new document. So I think that it would be wise for us to look at what other people have done, but at the same time figure out what we need for our community.
And actually develop the wording for the.
I would
That might be
encourage
good. task for over the summer. This summer.
I think that'd be, and I think we should get a small committee of people that are, proficient or like to be involved in protecting those rights.
So the easement,
Paul?
oh, sorry, Paul.
So in that last one of the purchase of the avigation easement,
Yes.
It was described there as being, it gives an option for those who don't have an option to have their home insulated, similarly, presumably to the sales assistance. Is it also available to those who do qualify?
It's one or the other. You have to pick one program.
I do, or
The homeowner.
Right. So
there would
right,
be.
So if I, as a homeowner, am eligible for an interior insulation, but I, for whatever reason, would prefer to just get this, is that an option?
Yes, that can be an option.
The
If the
reason I
plan
was-
recommends easements,
Yep.
then that can be an option. And if somebody would rather get the check for whatever it's going to be, $3,000, because they want to go to Jamaica, then they can use that.
The reason I asked the question is that in reading through this documents, and I appreciate the nuance of sometimes there's going to be a home that wouldn't be eligible, but there's sort of two buckets that sort of occurred to me here as I was reading through it. And I sort of want to verify that I'm thinking about this correctly. So setting aside the removal program, within this universe of 4 or 5 programs, there's sort of, to me, two buckets. Those which result in a home that has seen an investment take place in that home, and those which do not.
Okay.
Is that an accurate statement? So if I decide to do on the trip to Jamaica, that house, that homeowner has benefited, but the house,
Correct.
it is no longer eligible for an improvement.
That is correct.
And so there's sort of two buckets here that go on, of one where the house itself has received an investment, and then some where the house itself has not, maybe because it couldn't,
Correct.
or maybe because of
It
a choice.
didn't need it, and is how the FAA would phrase that, if it were not
Right,
eligible.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important, to me, that's an important thing for us to be, as communities and neighbors, talking about, both in terms of the very important interests of the current homeowner and also of what happens to that housing 5 years from now, 10 years from now,
And again,
and the neighbors around that house that is maybe more or less desirable over time.
Correct.
So just a thought.
You could actually have homes that are in a situation where they have been significantly improved
correct.
and would not qualify for the sound insulation program because the monies that were invested there would not gain the minimum 5 dBA
Right.
reduction.
Or you could have
or
somebody
get
who
the
had an
interior.
important short-term payment,
Yep.
decided to not improve the house, and then
Right.
whoever they sell it to in 5 years' time can't get that improvement.
But see, the key is the homeowner makes that decision because the municipality cannot, because
Right,
if
no,
they
no.
do, it's a taking.
I'm flagging the question as a subject because the homeowner 10 years from now doesn't get to make that choice. It's
That's
today's
true.
homeowner that
It
gets
goes
to
with
make
the
it.
land, basically. The easement rights with the land, not with the owner.
Runs with
But the
the
community maintains the housing stock portfolio. So I think the
Well,
point you're making
yeah.
is it has the potential to devalue the stock as a whole.
In the long term.
Yeah, I think, Paul, where you're going with there's going to be one, person who's going to want to take the money instead of sound insulation. And that's the question for the committee and for the airport to decide is this something that they want to include in the NCP? Furthermore, like the sound barriers, we can include it, but it's up to the airport to decide what they're going to implement. So what I have seen in terms of people at other airports and where easements are purchased by people are usually a lot of rental properties.
That's another interesting question, right? Because a landlord has a different
Absentee
long-term
landlord.
interest than
Right.
yeah.
Now, I will say for rental properties, typically for rental properties, landlords, if they can get sound insulation, they will take that. That's a pretty valuable upgrade to the property.
Why not make it a requirement?
It's a voluntary program. You can't.
Well, it's voluntary in terms of you can choose the easement payment. one-time payment, or you can get the insulation. Why give the choice?
That's what this process is for, is to decide whether we want to, whether the community and the airport wants to offer a choice or not. Yeah,
And
it's
when
a good question.
when we've referenced that to the FAA, every single time we've gotten the response back that this really has to be a homeowner decision. Obviously, there's a technical committee here to talk about things like this, to put into the document itself, but the homeowner has to be involved in this decision.
Well, this is really helpful, and we're not a decision-making body, but B, we're definitely not making any decisions today, even if we were. But being able to understand the subject so we can speak collectively to the community and have the community speak with us, both in terms of what their important interest is for their home, and also what are they looking for their neighborhood and for their community. And both of those are important elements
And I
for
think
people
we
as they
would
make their
stand
individual decisions.
right next to you and saying that we would want to invest in the community, but we can't make that decision for a homeowner.
Okay.
Are there any prohibitions or examples of places where communities have partnered on these NCP programs to provide local funding matches to further a community value? Do you know what I'm saying? Like if our value as Winooski was to say, we want as many people who qualify for insulation to get the insulation and not just take the easements. But for whatever reason, the program comes out that they have the choice. We have a rental register, and there's a rental properties. We have a rental registry where we have funds that landlords can use to leverage home improvements. Could we, as a municipality, decide to partner with the sound mitigation funds for them to do more improvements while those improvements are made, or is there some,
Yes.
is the municipality not allowed to put its thumb on the scale like that?
No, that is something that can be done if the airport and the jurisdiction are in agreement. It doesn't have to just be jurisdictional. There are programs that partner with energy, sound insulation, and we partner with energy programs to get energy rebates or upgrades to air conditioning systems or heating systems. An example is the FAA only pays, if you're going to put in an air conditioning system, they only pay for what the code calls for, but you might want a more efficient system. So you can partner with your local utility company or local jurisdiction, and they can kick in the difference for that more efficient system. So those types of things are absolutely possible.
We've already
had some examples of that. That might be interesting to look at.
And we've already started some discussion with Efficiency Vermont and BED, Vermont Gas, GA, all the other utilities.
Another idea you might want to think about, Paul and Winooski, is that we may want to think about making some of these perpetually affordable. So that maybe if the city has affordability funds, or that we put them with these houses, or certain ones that, and then we keep them.
Do you mean that in the instance of, say, the purchase assurance program where somebody sold it to the airport, it was insulated and then?
And what I'm saying is that, we're probably going to go through a slight drop, we have a lot of housing being built right now. So sometime in the next 10 years, you're going to see a drop, I'm anticipating. And when that happens, it would probably be a great opportunity for us to keep things affordable, is if we have an opportunity to put our monies together and put somebody in that would otherwise afford it and then make it perpetually affordable, then we know that at least that stock of housing is going to be there for us in the future.
It's a really neat idea, and I guess I would add to it that while there is a lot of housing being built, there's very little housing like this being built. And so this is a really squeeze on the market, and being able to help it be affordable for a young family would be
I think we're going through some of our best times right now, but we could be headed to a bump. And even Winooski, I know that you're having some good times as far as property values. And we recently met with somebody, and they went well over the contract, the asking price. So there's a demand on the market today. When the glut comes into the market, all these houses get built out and apartments. I think the market's going to shift for a little bit, and we should take advantage of it.
I know the available housing.
What did you say?
No, he's not.
The available housing right now in the market now is actually down, so it's a seller's market. But what is exacerbating that problem is the feds are jacking up the interest rates.
Yep.
So whatever homes are available, most people can't afford them.
It's going to come together, George, at some point.
Yeah.
And when it does, I would look at tools in our toolbox that we're able to help people and get people into homes.
So are you saying, like, if somebody didn't want an air conditioner, but they wanted, let's say, a heat pump, which does both, so you can negotiate that kind of a thing instead of taking what the program says, not really?
Air conditioning is a
talking about
completely
funding?
separate issue, yeah, for the FAA.
Okay.
And it's very complicated with all the new rules that they've put in place and what you can and can't put in for sound insulation. And if you have existing air conditioning, then it's a heat pump type situation. If you have nothing, then they would put in a central system. So that all has to be negotiated through the FAA once the program's approved. But if you're looking for, in the case of one project, the code calls for a 13 SEER air conditioner, and the community wanted 17 SEER. So we partnered to get them higher, more efficient equipment in their homes that lasted longer. So it's those types of things. We've also seen it with partnering with things like grant dollars, community block development grant type stuff, or home repairs if there's issues with the homes, to try and roof repairs or those types of things. So, and I will say, just generally speaking, there's usually very few people choose an easement if they have the option to choose something else. If you're offered new windows and doors, or a couple $1,000s, people usually choose the windows and doors. So we don't see a lot of those types of things generally. Land acquisition, all about. I'm not going to repeat this. I know it's a sensitive subject, but we do want to just remind people the 75 DNL is the FAA wants to see those houses gone. It's not feasible or practical to provide sound insulation. And so while the airport has stopped the acquisition program, it is something that is the only options for homes that are in the 75 DNL contour. You know how long the process takes, and it involves the acquisition of a home and the relocation of the occupants. And as Jean mentioned, having those homes before they're raised, it's very costly with maintenance as well as security to the neighborhood, and so it's usually not something that people are highly in favor of. So we put together just quickly a table. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just before you move on, are public buildings that are not residences available? I mean, just for example, would Chamberlain School be available for the purchase program if the DNL line moves out?
Purchase?
If it's within
the 75.
If it's within the 75.
Correct. It would be eligible for acquisition.
Okay.
Yeah. Churches, schools, those types of things. So we did, and this is in your handout, we did look at if the airport received a $5 million grant, what would be the average cost for a home to go through any one of these programs, and then how many homes would they be able to get out of the $5 million. And the reason we did this exercise was to just illustrate, if we do purchase assurance, there's a high cost to that, about $355,000 based on the current acquisitions of the homes here that the airport's been buying. And so how far will your dollars go? And so as we look at a mixture of sound insulation and land acquisition and sales assistance, if you're looking at an annual $5 million grant, you can start to see how much activity would happen in a given year for the airport to be mitigating these homes.
I know you wouldn't. I'm sure you knew that you wouldn't be able to get through another slide without me posing another question. Sorry.
Not at all.
So, in the purchase assurance program, my understanding is that a airport purchases the home,
yes,
and then insulates it.
Correct.
And then sells it at some future time.
Correct.
What happens to the proceeds from the sale?
Proceeds from the sale have to go back into the noise program.
The local noise program or the noise
The local airport's noise program.
So, if understanding that there's lag there, this cost per home, does that sort of become almost like a revolving fund where the net outlay is closer to, say, 50,000 or 55? Whereas because the 350 is the expense up front, but let's say you sell the home for whatever the market value is,
Right.
250 to 300.
Right.
That 250 to 300 can then go into the next home. No.
Correct. That's correct.
I feel like this should represent that because it's not a.
So
Because if you sell 12 homes, you can then, without getting another airport grant,
You could have
almost
12
buy
more homes.
or at least
Right.
8 more.
Yeah.
And that's not the same thing as the acquisition and relocation where that home's torn down.
Right.
There is no more value
Yeah.
to be recouped.
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul, and I can clarify that money has to be, that money is available to the airport to be used for noise mitigation.
So I'd almost have sort of 2 lines in there where
Okay.
it's approximately 55 is a sunk cost and then approximately 300 is reinvestable.
Yeah, I'd like to look into that more too, because we have
Yeah.
timelines on our grant closures, et cetera, that we have to follow too.
Okay.
That's a
Nick
really.
Because
could ask the
it
same
makes it seem
question.
like much more expensive than the sound insulation, but with the understanding that there's a carrying cost, I'm not sure that it is.
Well, I think we have to, if we're going to do the math, then we have to do all the math, which includes all the maintenance.
Yep, understood.
Yeah,
That's fair.
and all of
But
that,
it's-
because
right.
there
And-
are
and-
costs associated with maintaining the property and the sound insulation of the property.
Yep, and that's fair, but I think
And we
it
can
should
do
all
that.
go into the calculus. 'Cause
Sure.
It seems it's presented as a net,
Yep.
a complete net expenditure, and I'm
Right.
not sure that it is.
Okay.
But there is a recovery.
Right. Or a reinvestment.
Sorry.
Or a reinvestment.
Right, it doesn't go back in some federal either,
No.
either, it sounds like, so.
Only if the airport stops the noise program and then they sell later, then it would go into other airport programs, and then if
Right,
they
but
don't,
that's
are doing
not
any
likely to
grants,
happen in the first few
Yeah.
dozen homes.
so
I don't imagine.
that money will be here for a while.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There's no limit as to how long an AIP goes, right?
There is.
Yes.
There is?
Yeah, yeah. There's a 4-year limit on
Yes.
how long the AIP grant, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah.
Grant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long the grant can be open. We
Yes.
can add an extension, we can request an extension.
So then wouldn't it behoove the airport then to go after buckets of money for each one of those programs to basically be able to get 4-year periods out of each one instead of putting them all in just one AIP for the separate programs?
Well,
Potentially, I don't know.
yeah, one of the things to consider
In parallel.
is
Yeah,
that
that's what I do.
if
Yeah.
you
For those who
if you
want
get
sound
a
insulation.
grant for sound insulation and a grant for sales
Right.
assistance, and you don't have anybody who wants to do sales assistance, you have a pot of money sitting there that could have been used for sound insulation if you had a ton of people who wanted sound insulation. So if the grant is, I want to do all of these things, then you can use that money however it needs to be spent.
pot.
If it's in one
But
pot,
then you
and you're
have 4
spending the
years to
money.
do everything.
That's right.
Well, 4 years on that one grant.
On that one
We can
grant,
always open
yeah.
up a new grant as well, and start another 4-year grant.
Yeah.
So what she's saying is if one homeowner says, we want the sound insulation program, and then later says, well, maybe the purchase assurance is what we want, then I can still transfer
You can
that
slide
that money.
over if it's
Correct.
in one grant.
Reallocate,
versus the 4
yeah.
grant.
As long as it's in the grant, then you're able to move it around a little easier than if it's in a separate grant.
I get it.
And that's a lot of what Gene and Nick deal with is, they have a grant, but it doesn't have the noise exposure map in it.
That's
so.
a perfect example of with the trying to get that into an
Right.
open grant
Into an open grant where there's money.
when it wasn't originally stated.
So we've touched on all of these. We're sort of at the end of the review of those mitigation measures, and I didn't know if anybody wanted to circle back to
I know
anything.
you've said it already, but I just wanted to say it one more time. This is an FAA program that is only good if there's money. And, so just remember that, because, I don't want anybody to say later, you said, you didn't say anything, really. It's really as good as the program. And the money. And my point, if they start cutting things to balance the budget,
As long as
This could
the
be one of
feds
the
can pass
things.
their budgets.
Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
So to this slide, I guess I'd say, given that we have a little extra time in here, I think we'd be very interested in being able to use this time to communicate with our constituents, the neighborhoods, and have a good, fruitful dialogue now that you've shared the details on all of these programs with us, rather than answering tonight on which of these should be in and out, other than what we're already talked about in terms of the removals. And I think we already essentially talked about it.
right. Are we in consensus that I mean, knowing that this map is coming and it's coming in the next 6 months or so, we think would be very enlightening to know what the new map's going to look like to help make decisions for people.
I think that though it's a little bit frustrating to all of us to potentially have a delay in the funding, I'm imagining fast forward 8 months and the first one of our residents who raised their hand and said, wait a minute, this is based on the old maps, not the ones that just came out last week, and we can't with a straight face say that we plowed forward with this and didn't pay attention to the new maps that everybody's been talking about and clamoring about for a period of time.
But we've already kind of done that, right, with the afterburners and everything, and that part of our past, and it'd probably be good not to repeat it. You know what I mean? Let's try to take our time and get it right. So,
By the way, let's hope that the United States Air Force gives us good data with regards to the number of times that we're going to use Afterburner and the F-35A as well.
If they don't, we will give you their number.
1-800-GO-GUARD.
Well, it's interesting because it is the Burlington International Airport's NEM, not the United States Air Force. So if we want to make different assumptions, like, hey, they said 5% of the time, we're going to say, no, we're going to double it. We can do that. Because as long as we can defend our assumptions, we can do that. Right?
I'm not really good at that yet. I would have to I'd defer to the people who are going to be working on that with us. Can you monkey with the numbers?
That wording, no.
It is a prediction. It's not absolute. And the prediction is only as good as the assumptions or the data that's fed into the
The
model.
assumptions
So
about
there you
any of the operational profiles would have to be submitted with a letter of concurrence from the Guard, and the FAA would approve in terms of the profile, afterburner, not afterburner, things like that. So this will be reviewed by the FAA. So no, we won't be able to unilaterally make a decision on what to put in there. We're going to have to collect the best information we have, put back up, and have someone sign off on saying these are reasonable estimates of what we're going to be doing.
So the FAA is actually going to scrutinize this NEM this time? And they didn't the time before or the time before?
Well, they definitely did on the 2015 map. We went back and forth. Actually, we extended the length of the project by a good amount of time. That was a 2012 grant, submitted in 2015.
You don't want that this time.
So with the committee's concurrence, I'd like to propose to cancel the May TAC meeting, reconvene the Sound Mitigation Committee in June, and we'll send out some dates to the committee. Again, quarterly, probably June, July, August, September again, depending on when the noise exposure map comes out.
I do like the suggestion that Gene had of maybe we can use some of that time to be working on things like navigation easement. So I don't know if that counts as TAC or sound insulation or whatever. It's the same people, but there are things that we can be working on in the meantime. We don't have to stop.
And I think that's a perfect first item on the June sound mitigation.
So, Jesse, you will have your people there as well. I mean, at that for the easement as well.
Sure.
Okay. And what's coming up? Yeah, so we should bring the list in as well.
We're part of both.
I know, but we should ask them to be part of that exercise. I really think it's important. I think it's important. I guess one thing that if we're going to do it, we invite everybody to the table. Even if they're not at the table, we ask them to be at the table for those meetings and we make it available and they can make it really quick. I just want to get it right so it fits everybody.
I do think it would be helpful, and we talked about this on the phone, to, I did brief the council on this parallel schedules. They know it's coming, but if the airport had a schedule, kind of the slide with the schedule of both of the processes and how they're going to line up and when the public can expect to hear, I think that would be great to get out in front of it, so they're not just hearing, oh, in 2 weeks there's this huge meeting, be prepared, but in 4 months, you're going to be invited to a meeting where this is going to happen. It may tamp down some of the other concerns community members are having about next year and what comes next. And
I think I
like a
said,
one-pager
We're
would be
working on
really
that,
helpful.
so we'll.
That'd be great.
similarly, I think I said this at the last TAC meeting, but I think we'd be really interested in having an opportunity from your last slide there to give some feedback of what we're hearing in the community, of which measures might be our priorities before there's a draft plan.
Okay.
Because a draft plan feels very final to people, whereas an opportunity to weigh in, have a meeting where we share all of our feedback to you, and then, obviously we won't necessarily all agree, nor is that necessarily FAA priorities, but at least that input would be part of the development of the plan.
Okay.
That would be really helpful, I think.
That's a good suggestion.
We'll do it.
And then obviously the public can weigh in on the draft itself also.
Can I just ask a quick question? When do you think the one pager that Jesse's asking for, when do you think you might have that available?
I know that we were working on it today, so we'll have it either tomorrow or Monday.
So we'll get it to you before tomorrow, Monday. So what we will do is we'll get it to Paul for you for South Burlington, Jesse, you for Winooski, and is there another?
We'll send it out to the entire
we'll send it to
committee.
the
Oh,
entire-
and
schedule.
we'll put it on our website.
Yeah.
And is there other things we should be doing in putting it out there? Or?
Just a suggestion, if you all share it on your Facebook page and then we can share it, it gives credit back to you all for pushing it out there as opposed to it coming from us,
We will do that.
which might be a useful thing.
Done.
Good, so with that, I'll adjourn this meeting and reach out to everybody to set up a June sound mitigation.
It'll be warm then.
Yeah.
Be warned.
Thanks, everybody. very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Did everybody get a parking?